The verb paralabon is quite significant in that it means he received this teaching from tu kurios, from the Lord. If the terminology for many, which we're told, was so essential, we're quite stunned that a teaching that Paul received from God himself lacks these very words. And another point that is very important to bring out is this is another verse of Scripture that has not only been formally defined, but it is a verse that's formally defined as teaching a true sacrificial aspect of holy orders and the Eucharistic presence of Christ.
Okay, before I do my 4-minute response, do you mind if I ask you for a yes or no clarification?
Sure, go ahead.
Do you believe that the words in Luke 22 are sufficient for a consecration?
For the consecration of the Eucharist?
Yeah, would that be valid? That's what you're arguing, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, I'm going to respond to that in 4 minutes.
Go ahead.
Yes, that answer demonstrates that you are, as I pointed out in the last debate, still a Protestant. You believe in sola scriptura. St. Thomas Aquinas specifically addressed this objection. In Summa Theologica, Part 3, Question 78, Article 3, someone objected to St. Thomas, and he made reference, this person objecting, to the forms, or the words, rather, in the Gospel accounts of the Eucharist. And this person who's making the objection, like you, says, well, not all of these words are in these Gospel accounts. And St. Thomas, who was a Catholic, you unfortunately are not, he understood the faith. He pointed out, the evangelists, meaning the Gospel writers, did not intend to hand down the forms of the sacraments, which in the primitive church had to be kept concealed, as Dionysius observes at the close of his book on the ecclesiastical history. Their object was to write the story of Christ. And so St. Thomas Aquinas specifically refutes your false argument that the gospel accounts are sufficient forms of consecration. That's not what they are. They're true accounts of what occurred, but for instance in Luke, we don't even have the words many. We know Jesus said many. We know it from Matthew 26. And so he's taking a snapshot of what is said. Okay? He's not indicating everything that Jesus said. And it's not sufficient for a consecration. So the fact that you would make that argument demonstrates that you don't have the first clue about Catholic teaching and that your whole orientation is still corrupted by a sola scriptura Protestant methodology. That's your problem. And so St. Thomas Aquinas shoots down your false and actually heretical argument, which is further refuted by the Council of Florence. But let me quote, just to show how ridiculous what you're saying is, let me quote Pope Benedict XIV and St. Alphonsus, who both further point out why all is not acceptable. Pope Benedict XIV says, and he comments on what St. Thomas Aquinas said, because as I said earlier, St. Thomas Aquinas took the objection, all should be in the consecration, and he said, no. He said, Jesus expressly says for you and for many because he's expressing the elect. Pope Benedict XIV backs this up in his work on the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And he said, quote, having agreed with the same angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, we explain those words for many accordingly. And he goes on to say, even though we grant that in some other scriptures, he goes, even though granted that the word many, after a manner of speaking in the Holy Scriptures, may signify all. In other words, you hear this ridiculous argument put out by you and other members of the Vatican II Church that, well, all and many are interchangeable in certain passages of Scripture. That's completely irrelevant. They're not interchangeable in all passages of Scripture and in all places, and they are not interchangeable in the form of consecration because, as Pope Benedict XIV goes on to explain and confirm, because it's only expressing the elect. And he says, his blood was shed for the elect only as regards efficacy, as the Dr. Thomas explains correctly. And therefore Jesus says expressly, for you the Jews and for many, namely the Gentiles. In other words, he says expressly for many, not for all, because he's talking about the elect. And so that is further actually repeated by St. Alphonsus in his treatise on the Holy Eucharist, where he says the exact same thing. And I have about 10 seconds, and I'll just point out that there is absolutely no doubt that these... Well, my time's up.
All right. In regards to few comments that Peter Diamond has made in regards to Benedict and Alphonsus Liguori. It is interesting that I recommend anybody take the time to look up those relevant quotes to read what these individuals are saying. I simply don't have enough time to go into it. I'll simply say that they are referring to all in the sense of universalism, and such is not an aspect of the Novus Ordo. But going back to Luke 22, I love the fact that Peter Diamond stopped me to ask me if I thought this was a valid consecration. Because, Peter Diamond loves quoting St. Thomas as if he's the Pope or if he's some infallible decree or something. I'm going to go ahead and stick to some real infallible decrees. And while we're on the topic about councils and infallible decrees and what have you, I think it's appropriate to mention a few very important details in regards to the relevant issue at hand. The Council of Trent, not Thomas Aquinas, the Council of Trent formally defined the text. That the text of Matthew 26:26, Luke 22:19, and 1 Corinthians 11:23, and they say that it was officially decreed that these were texts that show the reality of the presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. In Luke 22:19 and 1 Corinthians 11:24, they are also formally defined as texts that show the reality of holy orders. These verses show that the text evinces an actual, real sacrifice, hence the definition that this shows the reality of the sacrament of holy orders. Since these texts show the institution of the priesthood and evince an actual, real sacrifice, we realize how unimportant the usage of for many is, as it's absent in both of these formally defined texts, yet both contain valid sacrifices. An argument that I presented to Peter Diamond before, that of the fact that as long as the anamnesis is present, which it is in Luke and 1 Corinthians, we have an actual sacrifice. If anyone were to examine the text, they'll find the English rendering and command to do this in remembrance of me. 1 Corinthians 11:24 reads, "Do this in remembrance of me," as does Luke 22:19. The anamnesis, each and every single time it is used in contextual cases of worship, is in reference to an actual sacrifice in the New Testament and the Septuagint. If Peter Diamond is to be consistent, he would have to say that Luke and Paul's omission of for many renders their Mass as invalid. But that is a ludicrous claim that not even Mr. Diamond would be willing to say. And so how is Mr. Diamond going to get himself out of this bind? How is Mr. Diamond going to answer the fact that these formally defined verses refer to an actual and real sacrifice, yet they lack the formula that he says would invalidate a real sacrifice if it were to be absent? Corny of Florence, De Defectibus, or even the Catechism of Trent surely cannot help Mr. Diamond's case, because neither of them tell us that for many must be used or it would invalidate the Mass. Mr. Diamond is in the world of Scripture right now. If he is going to say that the Church has already stated that for many is absolutely needed for a valid sacrifice, then it would seem that the Church has contradicted itself, because these verses are formally defined by the Church, and these verses show a real, actual sacrifice, and these verses lack the formula for many. There is no wriggling out of the bind that Mr. Diamond has found himself in, because Mr. Diamond, before he went on to speaking and called me, basically said I wasn't a Catholic. I don't know if Mr. Diamond is of the persuasion that Thomas Aquinas is an infallible decree, but let's say that St. Thomas does say that for all cannot be used. Let's just say Mr. Diamond's right. St. Thomas does say that. Well, are we to take St. Thomas Aquinas as dogma? Would we take St. Thomas's word as being sufficient when he denied the Immaculate Conception? St. Thomas Aquinas is not the magisterium of the Church. He never says. And in fact, St. Albert, Robert Bellman, Liguori, all disagreed with him on many different topics. In fact, there is no doctor of the Church, not one, that agrees that the short form does not suffice. And as such, this is a ridiculous argument. I will now surrender the rest of my time to Peter Diamond.
Okay, wow, there's a lot of false statements to refute there. No doctor of the Church has ever said that the short form doesn't suffice. Well, St. Thomas himself says that. He says it in 3 different places. He says it in Summa Theologica, Part 3, Question 78, Article 3. He said, some say this is the chalice of my blood is all you need. And he says this seems incorrect. Okay? It's just ridiculous to say that according to you. Well, you obviously don't have the first clue what you're talking about. St. Thomas Aquinas says that very thing. He also says it in Scriptum Super Liber For Sententiarium and in other places. But you say the Council of Florence and Pope St. Pius V do not say many's necessary. Yes, they do. They both say many's part of the form. And Pope St. Pius V says that if you change the form and change the meaning, it's invalid. Well, does all change the meaning? Okay, let's weigh this. William Albrecht says no. Pope Benedict XIV says yes. St. Thomas Aquinas says yes. St. Alphonsus says yes. The Catechism of Trent says Jesus didn't use all because that would have expressed not what he was intending to express. So let's weigh those two. Obviously, you're wrong. Now, you say St. Thomas is not infallible. That's true. But when he's in perfect line with the Council of Florence, Pope St. Pius V, Pope Benedict XIV, St. Alphonsus, what the Church has always taught, then obviously he holds great weight normally, and we should normally give great respect to what he has to say. If there's something of greater weight that contradicts him, then we would go with the papal decree. But in this case, they're all in line. They're all saying that all is not acceptable in the consecration. We further know it's true from the Council of Florence. But before I get to that, I want to move back to the falsehood you uttered earlier about those ancient rites.